To this now, Minister of International Relations Dr. Naledi Pandor has called for the transformation of the United Nations Security Council. Pandor is hosting her Japanese counterpart, Yoshimasa Hayashi, in Pretoria. Japan is currently serving as a non-permanent member on the Security Council. The International Relations Minister, who has just returned from the Russia-Africa Summit, says the world body has failed member countries. For more on this, we are now joined by International Relations Analyst Thembisa Fakude, and he joins us via our Zoom link. Thembisa, thank you so much for joining us here on the late edition. Perhaps let's dissect those comments coming out from the Minister of International Relations, saying that calling for transformation in the United Nations Security Council. What do you make of that?
Well, it's South Africa has been pushing this for quite some time. But of course, the question that arises, why are we so keen in joining a club that is responsible for deciding who lives and who dies? Because the United Security Council is mainly about that. Although, of course, over the years, there's been a lot of vetoing of decisions, because you must have a unanimous decision before you can carry out any decision of the United Security Council. But I just can't understand why South Africa is so keen on joining the United Nations Security Council and expanding it, because for me it's a very destructive platform. It's a platform that actually has in the past ratified certain violence against countries, whether because the UN want to force them to do certain things or stop them from just doing certain things. So I'm not quite sure whether it's the right place for South Africa to be lobbying to become. Nonetheless, of course, the platform changes and converts completely into becoming a peaceful platform. But at the moment, it doesn't seem or look like it's going to be pursuing that trajectory.
Yeah, and of course, you seem not to be very fond of the United Nations Security Council. Perhaps, maybe let's look at the importance of representation of African countries at the UN Security Council. What is the importance of us actually being there?
Well, the importance is that we're going to be part of the club. Currently, you have got 5 permanent members, including China, Russia, and United States. Other countries are not part of the P5 or permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, and their main responsibility, as I've said, these are countries that are known to have very strong armies, most of whom have got nuclear weapons. And if you do expand it to include at least South Africa, it means that South Africa once again joined this club. And as I've said, why are we so keen on joining a club that decides who lives and who dies on Earth?
And maybe, one would also ask that maybe there is some sort of an importance of, if we can see the Minister of International Relations calling for transformation, perhaps is there a way of members fighting these problems or issues from the inside of the United Nations Security Council?
Well, I think South Africa is more interested in a bipolar society or bipolar world where the powers and interest moves from certain countries around the world to include African countries, because African countries have been for a very long time excluded from important international decisions. And I think this might just do that. But I'm not quite sure whether this is one of those platforms that will fight tooth and nail to become part of. Mainly because South Africa hasn't got that much military power to protect itself. In fact, if you want to make more enemies, one will argue, the best place to do so is to join the United Nations Security Council.
And do you think maybe, South Africa's stance of being non-aligned when it comes to the issues here of Ukraine and Russia, do you think maybe it may have an effect in terms of how they contribute to the UN Security Council, and hence why we're seeing comments like this coming from the minister? Also, they're saying that, when it comes to, these countries and members, Naledi Pandor saying there that they are being failed.
Well, I think there's no doubt that if South Africa is accepted or does achieve the objective of expanding the United Nations Security Council, not only to include South Africa, but to include other countries, it will certainly be rubbing shoulders with the big boys and the big countries around the world in terms of having proper discussions on the security of the international community. But so far, we haven't seen much constructive role of the United Nations Security Council, except, as I've said, if you want to make more enemies, you join the United Nations Security Council, because that's where basically decisions on who to condemn, who to attack, who not to attack is taking place. And I don't think South Africa is actually ready nor prepared, by the way, to be part of this club. Because if it does, it means that, it has to be ready at home to protect itself for whatever possible pushbacks should it, for example, at some point make a decision that might offend certain countries or groupings around the world. So we are taking on a very sensitive responsibility, and given our military preparedness, I'm not quite sure whether it's the right time for us to be pushing to be part of this of the United Nations Security Council.
Well, do you think that there's a collaboration perhaps needed by countries who are not well represented in the UN Security Council?
Well, I think so. I think it's important that we widen the discussion and the consensus, particularly when it comes to matters of global security. So South Africa has been pushing for that. But importantly, also part of the South Africa's campaign towards a multipolar world. This is, again, an appropriate discussion, an appropriate engagement. But as I've said, I'm not quite sure whether this particular one is the one that we should start with. There are many other platforms I think we should push for inclusion. I'm glad that the G20, for example, has now proposed to expand and include another permanent member in the form of AU. South Africa has always been the only African country in there. But I think we should push at other platforms as well, that we get African voices represented and heard, and must also push at the bilaterals between ourselves and these powerful countries. But United Nations Security Council is known for one thing, and that thing is declaration of sanctions, declarations of war, condemnation of countries for attacking others. And I think South Africa perhaps might just amplify its other causes within the United Nations Security Council, particularly on issues of Palestine, Cuba, etc. But again, I'm not quite sure whether we are ready for it, given our own preparedness in terms of, the decisions that are often made in there. Because those kind of decisions that are made, they often invite certain backlashes. And South Africa is known for its friendly foreign policy, and now we are going to be forced to make really hard foreign policy decisions if we do join the United Nations Security Council permanently.
Yeah, and maybe let's look at the way forward for South Africa. What direction should they be taking in terms of the UN Security Council?
South Africa should be pushing for peaceful platforms, and should be pushing for a trajectory that will pursue peace around the world within the security, within the United Nations Security Council, which I think is a tall order at the moment. South Africa should be pushing for the denuclearization of the world. South Africa should be entrenching itself on climate change efforts globally, and I think it should amplify its voices in all of those platforms that pushes for the awareness of the deterioration of our climate internationally, as we've seen happening. I mean, we're having floods, we're having heat waves around the world. And I think South Africa, it's well placed, and it could be much more constructive in playing that role. So the role of denuclearization, for example, the role of fighting the environmental deterioration that we see happening around the world. But I'm not quite sure whether the UN Security Council is one platform that we should be fighting, as we're doing at the moment, to be part of.
Thembisa Fakude, thank you so much for your time. That is Thembisa Fakude, International Relations Analyst.